Okay, so good evening, everybody. We are heading towards the festival, the Jewish holiday of what's called Shavuot, or translated the Festival of Weeks. But the main thing about it is that on the 50th day of after 7 weeks had been counted, on the 50th day, was the day of the giving of the Torah, when the Torah was given. The title of this class is 3 Torahs. There were actually, on that day, it wasn't just one Torah that was given, it was actually 3. But they are 3 Torahs that were all one. 3 Torahs that were all one. And I'm going to explain this concept based on a teaching in the very famous work called the Sefer Yetzirah. Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Formation. Traditionally, it's understood to have been written by Abraham. And it is probably the most ancient Kabbalistic text that we have, the Sefer Yetzirah. It was put together in the current format, probably somewhere in the 800s, 1000s, somewhere around there, maybe even earlier. But it was a tradition that was handed down, and wasn't written down, was handed down or orally from Abraham. That's the tradition. All of Jewish tradition, really, except the written books, the written Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and the 19 books of the prophets, making 24 books in all. Those are the only written ones. Everything else was originally given, was transmitted orally from teacher to students. And it was only later on, when people started forgetting things, that it got to be written down. In any event, what are these 3 Torot? What are we talking about? So I'd like to actually show you the original formulation of the Sefer Yetzirah and what it says. So I'm assuming that you can all see that now. This is from an upcoming book. I didn't get to it yet, but it will be, eventually it'll be published, hopefully, as a book. So this is chapter 1, Perek Aleph, chapter 1. And the first Mishnah, the first statement, the first rabbinic statement in this work called the Sefer Yetzirah. So it's Sefer Yetzirah 1:1, the Book of Formation 1:1. Chapter 1, Mishnah teaching number 1. Okay, so it says like this. I'm not going to go through all of the ideas over here. It's going to take too long. But basically, he starts off with the concept of B'shloshim u'shtaim netivot pliyot chokhmah, with 32 paths of inscrutable wisdom. In other words, wisdom that cannot be fathomed, of unfathomable wisdom. God engraved, he engraved certain things, and we'll get to what those are. He engraved certain things in the being of existence, into the nature of existence. Let's put it that way. So then it continues with various holy names and so on, but the main point is the last few words over here. Ubara et olamo, and he created his world. In other words, he created the universe. And when we say the universe, we don't only mean one universe, the physical universe. We mean all the universes, the spiritual universes, as most people are familiar with by now. There are actually 5 universes that are spoken about in Kabbalah. Only one of them is the physical universe, and the others are spiritual universes. The world of Asiya is the spiritual counterpart of the physical universe. The physical universe is the lowest part of the world of Asiya. And then there's the world of Yetzirah, the world of formation, the world of Bria, which is the world of creation, the world of Atzilut, the world of emanation, and then finally the world of what's called Adam Kadmon, the primordial world. The world that transcends time and space, primordial world. It's the world that exists in thought, so to speak, in God's thoughts, and not in, there's no physical reality to it as such. Interestingly enough, in Kabbalah, the physical reality is actually the lowest level of reality. The higher things go into their source, the more real they are. So the ultimate truth is obviously God and what's going on in his mind, so to speak. Again, we're only using metaphors here. But that's the ultimate truth, and then it sort of filters down to with tzimtzum after tzimtzum, contraction after contraction, and veil after veil, and concealment after concealment, until we get a physical world around us, which is only a sort of a very, very dim memory of what really went on. So, in any event, ubara et olamo, he created his universes, bishlosha sfarim, with 3 books. The word Sefer means books. I'm going to explain what that means at much greater length shortly. He created his world with 3 Sefarim, 3 books, 3 types of books. And these books are called the Sefer, the author, the Sefer, the book, the Sipur, and the story. The author, the book, and the story. Now, there are a number of different versions of the Sefer Yetzirah, and several of them actually have a different version here when they talk about Sefer, Sofer, and Sipur. And let's just go and find that now. So here we are. Okay, I mentioned over here that there are other versions. Let me tell you what some of those other versions are. Some of those versions are, this is a footnote, Sefer Svar Usvor. Sefer is a book. Svar is a character, like a writing character. Svar, like a hieroglyphic would be a character, or a letter would be a character. Usvor, Sfor is a number. I'm sorry, Sfor is a limitation, a border. So there's 2 ways that they explain this. Sfar could mean number. It could also mean a character in an alphabet. Sfor is a border, a limitation, like a border around a country is called the boundary of a country is called a Sfor, a border. That's how the Ramak explains the Ramak, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, the main proponent of Kabbalah before the time of the Arizal. In fact, they were contemporaries to a certain extent. The Arizal was very young during the time of the Ramak, and they did meet and speak, apparently. Okay, there's another version, Vesfor, Vesefer, Vesipur. He has the concept of Sfor meaning a border again, a border, a boundary, Sefer, a book, Sipur, story, and there's various others, as you can see. There are various other versions. I'm going to stick to the version, which is the version that is found in Hasidic literature, particularly in the writings of the Chabad Rebbe's, Chabad Lubavitch Rebbe's, because it seems to make the most sense, and I'll explain why. What is Sefer, and Sipur? So there's a number of different ways that you can explain it. A number of different ways you can explain. What's the Sefer? The Sefer is the Torah. The Sefer is the author of the Torah, in other words, God. The Sipur is how the Torah unfolds through history. Now, when we say through history, it doesn't only mean the history of time, it also means the history of space. Because the Torah unfolds not only in time, but also in space. What does that mean? What that means is that the Torah that you have in this world, the Torah that we read from every Sabbath, and actually twice a week during the week as well, on Mondays and Thursdays, and on festivals and on the new months, the Torah that we read on a regular basis, that's the Torah that we have down here in this physical world. However, there is a Torah in each of the worlds. In other words, there's a Torah of the world of Yetzirah, there's a Torah of the world of Bria, Torah of the world of Hatzilut, Torah of the world of Adam Kadmon, and ultimately, the ultimate Torah is obviously in the Ora Ein Sof, in the infinite light of God. The infinite light of God, not in the essence, because the essence in this paradigm is the Sofer, the writer, the author. Right, so there's the Sefer, and the Sipur. Now, if you've ever seen a Torah, and I assume most of you have seen at least pictures of what a Torah is. It's a scroll that opens up, it unfolds, in other words. It's a scroll that unfolds, hinting to this idea of the unfolding of the story, right? The unfolding of the paradigm. What is the Torah? The Torah is a paradigm. It's the blueprint for every world. There are different levels of explanation of the Torah, and each of these explanations takes place in its own world. For example, in the world of Atzilut, the explanation of the Torah is Sod, the mystical explanation. In the world of Bria, it's Remez, that which is hinted to, but not so, but not necessarily explained fully. And so it goes on. Drash in the world of Yetzirah, and Sod in Pshat in the world of Asiya. So there's 4 levels of interpretation. These 4 levels of interpretation correspond to the 4 lower worlds. And then there's the primary Torah, what's called the Torah HaKduma. The Torah HaKduma, the primordial Torah, which is in the world of Adam Kadmon and even higher than Adam Kadmon. Okay. So what happened on the day of the giving of the Torah was that all of these things were given. In other words, the Sefer was given, the book of the Torah, the scroll of the Torah was given, even though actually in practical terms, it took Moses 40 days to actually write down what. There's a big discussion about this actually in the Talmud, whether Moses was given the Torah completed or he was given the Torah megillot, meaning parchment by parchment, piece by piece. As events unfolded, he was given he was told to write them down, and eventually on the last day of his life, he completed writing the Torah, except for, according to one opinion, except for the last 7 verses, which was written by Joshua, because Moses passed away, and the last 7 verses talk about his passing away. In any event, these the Torah was given. It began to be given on that day, according to this explanation, and was concluded on the last day of Moses' life on earth. And that's the Torah that we have today, passed down very, how shall I say it, precisely? Yeah, one Torah has to be copied very precisely from another one, or it is invalid. It's invalid, basically. It would be invalid if there's even one letter missing, or one letter incorrect, or even one letter that's broken. The entire Torah is invalid until that is fixed, or until the page is replaced. Now, if you think about it, the Torah was given 3,333 years ago. And if the normal lifespan, the lifespans then were much longer, but let's say a lifespan of a person, just for argument's sake, is 100 years. It's less than 100 years, but it doesn't matter. It's just for illustration's sake. 3,300, roughly 3,300 years would make 33 generations back. So we're not talking about a lot of, it seems to be a big distance in time, yes, but it's 33, a generation. I know it's not 100 years, but just for illustration's sake, we're talking about father to son to grandson to grandson and so on and so forth. 33 generations, maybe you could say 40 generations, 50 generations max, right? 50 generations back was the original, and one is copied from the other precisely and with tremendous devotion to, and he's making an exact copy exactly the way the letters are supposed to be written, and so on and so forth. In any event, it is it's a labor of love. We're talking about 305,000 letters, 305,000 plus letters. It's less than 306,000, 305,000. 400 and something letters, 405, I think, if I'm not mistaken, but that's whatever it is anyway. That is each letter is copied exactly. It has to be completely legible. Can't run into another letter. I mean, there's all kinds of laws and very precise methodologies about how it has to be done. In any event, that is the Sefer. But what is the Sipur? What is the Sipur? What is the story? Well, the story of the Torah in a very superficial sense is the stories that are told in the Torah. A lot of the Torah, particularly in the book of Genesis, is actually stories, as is in the book of Numbers and the book of Deuteronomy, but and Exodus as well. It's plenty of stories in Exodus. So it's mainly Genesis and Exodus that are the stories. Vayikra, the third book of the Torah, is mainly laws, and most of them to do with the priestly sect, and scattered throughout the rest of the other two books of the Torah, which is Numbers and Deuteronomy. There are stories and laws, and other things as well, but that's mostly what it is. In any event, so there's some people that explain on a very superficial level that the story of the Torah is the unfolding of the imprisonment of the time from the creation of the world, the creation of Adam, all the way through to the exile in Egypt, and then the redemption from Egypt, and then the journey through the desert until they got the Torah. Subsequently, when they've got the rudiments of the Torah, the 10 Commandments and various other Megillot, some of the parchments and so on of part of the Torah, and that was continued until the end of Moses' life. Then the Torah ends with the death of Moses. That is that's what's called the Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, or the Torah, or Pentateuch, whatever you want to call it, the written Bible, right? Then afterwards comes the writings of the prophets, starting with Joshua and so on and so forth. And those are also obviously included in the canon, but nevertheless, they're not the 5 books of Moses. The 5 books of Moses have a special sanctity and a special place. So that the unfolding of the stories, according to the superficial look at it, is how is the stories that are told in the Torah. On a deeper level, the stories are much more paradigmatic. They're paradigms of things that go on in they're paradigms of things that go on in life in general and in patterns of life as well. In other words, stories that are paradigms because they repeat themselves throughout history. People are also paradigmatic. In other words, there's a certain type of person. Obviously, everyone's an individual and everyone is unique in their own way, but there's certain general archetypes of people. And these archetypes and archetypal situations are the ones that are recorded in the Torah in order to be able to learn from them. It's much easier to learn from stories, or often it's easier to learn from stories than it is to learn from direct manual of activity, which is what the third book mostly is about. But in any event, that is the idea. I would like to get onto a deeper explanation of this, and that is the explanation that is given to us by the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov, through his foremost student, whose name was the Maggid Mezrich, Rabbi Dovber of Mezrich, in the town of Mezrich, writes that his teacher told him that the Torah was basically given as the teachings of the worlds. That's the lowest, that's the outer skin, so to speak, the outer shell. Worlds, souls, and godliness. So the 3 dimensions that correspond to Sefer, and Sipur. The Sefer is godliness. Sefer is souls. Sipur is simply the world as it unfolds. It's the story and it's the world. So what do we mean over here? Generally, the approach to Torah would be from the outside in. From the outside in, we see the unfolding of matters in history, and we try to extrapolate and extract from them what the basic principles are that underlie the events that happen in history. This is probably the way that most people do it, and historians certainly, and so on. In other words, from the secular point of view, that's where you really start from. You start from the outer event, and you try and move to the principles behind that event. Those principles behind the event, in other words, the blueprint would be the Sefer. That would be the Torah. The Torah is the blueprint, right? Ultimately, in the secular world, one doesn't get beyond that. You only get up to maybe the blueprint behind it, but not to the author. In other words, God, the author of the whole thing, the author of the system, and the author of the unfolding events in history. Now, all of these were given at the time that the Torah was given. Why? Because it says in the regarding the giving of the Torah, it says the word is Anochi, I, or I myself. The word Anochi, I myself. But the rabbis have pointed out that the word Anochi could be, it's a notarikon. Notarikon means that the initial letters, the letters of the word are the initial letters of a phrase. The phrase is like this: Ana nafshi ksavis yahavis. I gave myself in writing. And if you want to actually see it, let me do a new share. Whiteboard, here we go. I'll just write in Hebrew so you can see. You can see the word. Oh man, it's not a good color. Let me do black, it's much easier to see. All right, so the word Anochi, we go like that, Anochi. So that would be divided up. Each one is an initial of the word Anochi, means I. Nafshi, myself. Ksavis, writing, in writing. Yahavit, gave. I gave myself in writing. In other words, what's the Torah? The Torah is not just a book of stories. It's not a book of unfolding events. It's not a book of paradigms. It's a book of I myself. I myself, in other words, God talking, right? There's God talking over here. I gave you myself. And how did I give you myself? Well, I gave you myself in three ways. I gave you myself as myself. I gave you myself in souls. In other words, how God is invested in the soul of a human being. As we know from the beginning of the famous Hasidic work called Tanya, the first, second chapter, essentially, all right, the first and second chapter of Tanya discuss this idea that a person has two motivating forces within. One is called the animal soul, the other one's called the godly soul. The animal soul is what we're born with, and what we tend to become used to. And then at a later stage, at the stage of for a girl at the age of 12 and 1 day, the age of her bat mitzvah, and for a boy at the age of 13 and 1 day, they are regarded as responsible adults. In other words, responsible for their behavior and so on and so forth. Now, I know teenagers aren't what they used to be, but that is quite a young age. Nevertheless, that is the age of responsibility, and that is the age at which children are supposed to be able to make informed decisions. How can they make informed decisions? Because that's at the time at which the godly soul becomes operative. It operates at that time, and therefore you have two voices, so to speak, in your head: the animal voice, the animal soul, in other words, the survival instinct to a certain extent, and then there is the godly soul, the for what am I surviving soul, right? What is my purpose in this world soul, right? So we have these two voices within us, and that also came at the time of the giving of the Torah. Initially, it was only very, very holy people, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so on, Noah, Moses, and extremely holy people who managed to establish that divine relationship, that spark of divinity within them, that spoke to them and directed them and guided them and so on and so forth. But up until the time of the giving of the Torah, this was not a national phenomenon. It wasn't the phenomenon of a nation as a whole. At the time of the giving of Torah, this became the fact. This became reality. Prior to that, the idea was that you have to live according to you have to live a rational lifestyle. In other words, use your intellect to figure out what's right and wrong. At the point at which the Torah was given, right and wrong was already defined. And now a person was given this impetus towards right, towards godliness, towards the light, if you want to put it that way. And in fact, this is called, the second soul, the divine soul, or the godly soul, is called in Tanya, second chapter, part of God above, right? It's the part of God above. That's the divine soul that we have within us. For those who are, who work on it and work on it consistently, some are born like this, but mostly it's through working. We manage to enable the godly soul to dominate the animal soul. In a lot of people, that never happens. Some have to struggle continually with the animal soul, and some actually give up the fight. They just give in, and they become essentially the animal soul, and the godly soul is sort of at somewhat of a distance from them, in a sense, outside of themselves, and only reminding them from time to time a twinge of conscience, and so on. And I'm not only talking about moral behavior here, but I'm talking about just establishing a relationship with the divine, with godliness. So, so therefore, at this time, at the time that the Torah was given, what was given was not only I gave myself, but I also gave myself as myself. I gave myself as part of your consciousness, as divine consciousness. I gave that to you. That's embedded in a person, in potential, and comes into fruition at the age of 12 for a girl, 12 and a day for a girl, 13 and a day for a boy. Yes, it is true that boys mature at a later point than girls do. That is absolutely correct. At 13 for boys and 12 years for girls, it's not said that the children's souls separate from their parents. I'm trying to think if there's a statement that says something like that. I don't recall such a statement. Yes, a child can be required to be independent of his parents at that stage, but it's not necessarily something that I think I know what you mean. I think I know what you're talking about. When a child is in the womb, so then it's part of its mother, right? Essentially part of the mother, because it's completely dependent on the mother for nourishment, for everything, for oxygen, for whatever it may happen to be. It's completely dependent on the mother. As soon as the child is born, it's an independent, but nevertheless, it's an independent being, but with tremendous amount of dependencies until it starts to grow up until the age of 12 or 13. And then it becomes an independent, autonomous person that's responsible for their own actions. I don't know if, yeah, maybe. I'd have to think about that. I'm not sure that it's a soul that breaks away from the parent at 30. Maybe it could be. If you want to show me something that you read or whatever, then I'll be better informed about this. I don't think it's that way, but I could be wrong. In any event, so the first manifestation is the manifestation of God as himself. Second manifestation is God within the soul, within a person's consciousness. And that can become, through hard work, that can become a constant consciousness, like the constant contact kind of thing, but in a spiritual sense. And that can be constant, and it could also be intermittent, or it could be almost never. With some very evil people, it perhaps is never. Unfortunately, that can happen. And then there's the godliness that's invested in the world, the godliness that's invested in creation. And that was also, even though creation took place and it was already there, obviously, before the Torah was given. Again, the Torah was only given in the year 2448, right? In the Hebrew calendar, the year 2448, 2448 is when the Torah was given. So what happened on day one with the creation? Obviously, God created, or God said there shall be light, there was light, and so on, all the 10 utterances through which the world was created initially. However, the world did not have its purpose. It did not have its tikkun meaning rectification. It didn't have a direction, as we see immediately after the creation of Adam and Eve. Things started to go wrong, and then went drastically wrong during the time of Noah, to the extent that the world destroyed itself, basically. And then Noah was the only one that survived with his family, and started to rebuild the world. And eventually from that came Abraham, and then Isaac and Jacob and so on. They started to rectify human existence to be cognizant of the divine presence. That became formalized, obviously, at the time of the Torah. But when the Torah was given, it was given as a system. In other words, the creation now was given it was given a moral and ethical guide, but this was built into the creation itself. It was built in a way that can be discerned as the natural world, the world of balance, the world of divine creation. In other words, to put it in the way that it's put in the Kabbalistic books, is that the world exists only by virtue of God repeating those 10 utterances through which the world was created on a constant basis. In other words, they're being repeated continually in order for the world to remain the way it is. But this is now, even though that started off at the beginning of creation, now is revealed and understood to be that way. Now we understand how that actually came about and what the ultimate purpose is. So in other words, the construction of the world is an ongoing thing. There's a statement that we say every day in prayers, Hamachadesh b'chol yom tamid ma'aseh breshit, that God renews the creation constantly every day. Now, it doesn't mean only once a day, every day, but all the time, every day. Like it's constantly being renewed. Now, this is a very important idea. To digress for a minute, this is a very important idea that since the world is being renewed from moment to moment, one has the opportunity to enter into a new world at every moment. In other words, the world that was, the world of history, the world of who you were, has been recreated at every moment until now, and will be recreated again in the next moment. However, one can recreate it with an eye to the future rather than with an eye to the past. In other words, you can recreate it not on the basis of what was, but it can not recreated, I'm sorry, that's God that does that. It can be perceived on the basis of what was, and therefore what is simply a continuation of what was, or this moment can be a moment of turning around, and instead of looking backwards, looking at the past, looking towards the future. If anyone remembers the story of the wife of Lot, the wife of Lot looked back at the destruction of Sodom, of Sodom. She looked back at the destruction and turned into a pillar of salt. In other words, she just simply turned into a eternal preservative. Salt is a preservative. She was constantly stuck now in the past. That's where she was. She didn't change after that. She couldn't change after that. She became a pillar of salt, so to speak. I don't know if it's meant literally, but probably it is. And in the sense that it's meant the inner dimensional sense, in the sense of the Kabbalistic sense, she became stuck in the past. She could no longer change because she looked back at the moment when she should have looked forward. Now, that moment of having to should look forward is something that happens all the time now. And at any moment, the person could turn around and look forward. That turning around moment is actually called, there's a formal term for it in rabbinic literature. It's called tshuva, returning. It's turning around, right? Instead of looking backwards, we now we turn towards the future, we turn to look forward. That concept of tshuva, of looking forward, brings a person to a much greater awareness of godliness from moment to moment than he had before. That's what sort of defines it. So again, there's the godliness that manifests in the world, in creation. There's the godliness that manifests in the soul. And there's God as God is God, to just state of tautology. All of these were actually given at the time of the giving of the Torah, which is why it was such a watershed event. It was a momentous event. Nothing ever happened like that before, and has not happened since, and will not happen again until the final tikkun, when it says Torah chadasha mi'iti tetzeh, a new Torah will come out of me. Now, what that means, there's a lot to talk about there, and perhaps we'll talk about it in a future class. But when we say that a new Torah, a new teaching will come out of me, it won't be a new teaching in the sense that it's something that we were completely unaware of, but just a level of understanding, a depth, the 50th gate, essentially, the depth that we were not aware of. We will be made aware of. We will come to understand, and perhaps beyond that as well. But we'll talk about that perhaps in another class. The main point is that these three Torot, these three teachings, these three Ana Nafshi Ksavis Havis, I gave myself in writing. I gave you a godly soul, and I implanted the divinity into the world. These three things are all essentially one thing. And that's why they, based on the same three letters of Sefer, and Sipur, which is three letters just iterated, written out with different vowels. So the idea, therefore, is that when we study, we're not just studying a book. We're studying ourselves. We're studying the divine presence within the world. We're studying the divine presence within ourselves, and we're studying the ultimate divine presence as it is in himself, so to speak. That is why the day of the giving of the Torah was such a monumentous and monumental event. There you go. So that's it. Any questions, folks? Right. Don't seem to be too many questions right now, but I'll take questions if you just type them in the chat. Oh, okay. No questions. Good. Now, just a reminder again that I do give classes once a week. They're recorded on YouTube, and I'm also starting now to get much more involved in personal counseling. I don't know if counseling is the right word, but I would call it giving spiritual direction. It's probably a better way of speaking about it. To people, unfortunately, it doesn't. There is a fee for it, but in any event, it is available. Let me know if anyone can let me know if they're interested, and I think it has prices, etc., on the website. But I would imagine that a good session would be 20 minutes to half an hour. You can get a lot done in that time if you don't waste time. All right. Anyway, if there's no questions, then we'll just call it a day. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you. Happy Shavuot. Yeah, and to you too.